Okay, so this is the programming template that you'll get at the end of phase one, and I think it really helps you to organize that training week, right? So, kind of organize that microcycle, or whichever fancy term we want to use, to allow us to see where stress is being allocated and distributed across the week. So we're going to go through a little example now, and then I'm going to talk you through very briefly my thought process as we do. So hopefully you can give a little pause to this video now and think, okay, what did we say we're going to try and do? Is to distribute stress to allow the maximum performance in the week, so much recovery between sessions as possible, to train body parts twice per week, to maintain session density, right? So that we can keep like complementary pairs, upper, lower, push, pull, hinge with a press, squat with a pull, supine hinge with a pull, something along those lines. And we're going to do that by, first of all, placing the priority exercises, and that can either be due to your decision in terms of what the goal of the block is, or it can be the client's priority that's going to go in there first. Behind that, we're going to go with the most demanding exercises. Now, the most demanding exercises might be number one, right? Might be the goal of the block, or there might not be. There might not be any goal of the block, and you just simply start by saying, well, I want to place the most demanding exercises away from each other where possible. And there's always going to be some overlap with this. And then I'm going to fill the rest of the slots in with in mind the idea that I want to keep, like I said, sessions dense, train body parts twice per week, allow recovery where possible. And where recovery is a little bit short, then I know that I need to go to that section or go to that programming day and make some modifications, like more reps in reserve, further away from failure, less sets, and potentially choosing exercises that are of a shorter muscle length because they promote less muscle damage. So let's get stuck into it. So we said the example we're going to do is somebody training 3 days per week, 5 exercise slots per session. That's a total of 15 exercise slots. And I'm going to go with our classic full body. You can look to do something slightly different if you want, but full body typically works well. So I haven't got them here, but you would have had allocated your volume, right? You said, okay, of these 15 slots, where do I want to put my stress? Is it more biased towards squatting, or is it balanced, or whatever it might be? I'm just going to do this as we go along. So I've decided that we are going to have a squat day on day one. So I'm going to put one of these in here for now. We are going to have a pressing day on day 2, and that's going to be a vertical press. These are our main lifts, right? Because I've got 5 exercises, a main lift, and then 2 paired sets. So I'm going to go to my vertical push, and that's going to be on the first day, and then on my third day, it's going to be a hip dominant movement, okay? So that is the priority of the block. And if I want to, I can just highlight these 3 cells, and what I'm going to do is just put a slightly different color border around them. Let's make it red, so that we know they're the main lifts for that session, right? And I've tried to obviously start off with keep them away from each other, and knee dominant and hip dominant are further apart. So that's great. The next thing I need to do is place the most demanding exercises. Now I've decided that we're going to be squatting and hinging twice per week. So I'm actually going to put my hip dominant movement here on the second day, and I'm also going to put a squatting movement here on this day. So what we're saying is, for example, on Monday, I'm going to have the squat as the main lift, and then the deadlift pattern, the hip hinge pattern will be secondary, and vice versa. But we've still got plenty of recovery between those sessions whilst training 2 of those. Okay, with those placed, I'm just going to start to make it a bit random. Obviously, you guys are going to do it with some thought process, but I'm going to do it a little bit randomly just to kind of speed these things up. But what I'm looking at, and you'll see the video for here, is this tells me how many exercise slots is in session 1, session 2, and session 3. So at the moment, I've only got 1 exercise slot for session 2, and I've got 2 for session 1 and 3. And then it also tells you over the week how many you've got for each movement pattern. So now I'm going to start to spread out my pushing and my pulling. I probably don't want all my vertical pushing and pulling on the same day. It doesn't matter, it can be on a similar day, but I don't want it on the same day. And then I also typically, if I've got lots of pulling on a day, I don't necessarily want lots of hip hinging on that day either, because oftentimes grip can be an issue. So let's say that we're going to do horizontal push on the first and last day, and we're going to do a vertical push on day 3, and so that's our 2 slots for that. Then I'm going to do our pulling, so I'm going to choose a horizontal pull there, a vertical pull here, and potentially a vertical pull here. Now, obviously you guys would be allocating this dependent on the number that you've chosen prior to this. I'm just doing this for the example. But as we're starting to build through this, hopefully you can see that actually session 3, already has the 5 slots that we were after. It has 1 horizontal push, 1 vertical push, 1 vertical pull, a hip dominant movement, and a knee dominant movement. So now what I've got to do, I've still got 3 to allocate onto session 2, and then 1 to allocate on this last day. So we've got no supine hinge in here, so I'm definitely going to put some of that in on this day, and I think I can get away with some split stance work as well. Obviously, again, I've got to reiterate, I'm doing this just to show you my thought process. You guys would already know, right, we need 1 split stance or 1 supine hinge or whatever it is that it might be. Okay, so from there, I'm looking at this, I'm saying, well, let's say I had 1 hip dominant movement in there, right, and then the last pull, I could choose almost anything here, depending on what my allocation was, but we'll go for a horizontal pull. So what did I do? I got my priority movements in place first and tried to keep them away from each other, so we've got them on different days. Then I looked at my most demanding exercises and I said, okay, I want to keep them far away from each other, so I don't want to be doing like really heavy squats and deadlifts maybe here if we're going to be doing that on the next day. Now sometimes you might have to do that, most people will recover absolutely fine, but for this thought experiment I've kept them apart, right? With that in place, I've then thought, well, I want to try and spread out some of my pushing and pulling so that I don't have all my pushing on one day and all my pulling on another day. So I started to allocate my horizontal push and my vertical push, and then I started to do my vertical pulling, and then I filled in the rest, right? So I said, okay, I had a supine hinge, a split stance. So what do we have? Monday, we have our main lift, which would be a knee dominant movement. So I'd come in here and I'd put knee dominant movement. And then in terms of putting these exercises together, I'm now thinking, which ones are going to go best? Which patterns are going to go best? So for example, would a hip dominant movement and a horizontal pull work well together? They could do, but there's going to be competing demands there in terms of chest, bracing, lower back, and then also glutes and hamstrings. So if I go into a bent over row position, for example, I'm literally holding the bottom of what would be a deadlift. And so those glutes and hamstrings are going to get absolutely torched. So I might be thinking, okay, I'm not going to put a hip dominant movement with knee flexion because they're going to be really competing. So I know, why don't I put my hip dominant movement with my push and my horizontal pull with my knee flexion? So if I was now going to sort this session 1 out, we've said that our main lift is going to be a knee dominant movement. And if I just drag this down here, you guys will be able to see it as I move up and down. And then I'm going to pair my hip dominant movement, my secondary movement for the day, with my horizontal push. And then we said we're going to do my knee flexion with my horizontal pull, because they won't compete with each other. And then we'd be able to say, again, a little bit further down the line here for you guys, but we could say this is a compound movement, and you'll know this off your timings by now. And then these guys are going to get merged, and they're going to be a paired set, let's say, because we want more performance there, bigger movements. And knee flexion, horizontal pull, they can be some smaller movements, so we're going to merge those, and these are going to become a superset. So that would be session 1 organized. I'd go in and then do the same for session 2 and session 3. And so let's walk through this together with session 2. We've already said that, so over the week, in fact, let's look at it this way. Have we ticked the boxes that we said before in terms of distributing stress as well as we could, and making sure that most body parts are trained twice per week? Yes, we have. Have we made it so that we have the priority lifts getting as much recovery as possible? Yes, we have, because each one of them will always have at least a rest day before they're done, right? So no vertical pushing here, no horizontal hip dominant movement before, no knee dominant movement there. So they're all going to have maximum recovery. Then we put the most demanding movements in, hip dominant and squatting, try to keep them away from each other. Then we started considering pushing and pulling, separating those out. So now we've got density, we're training body parts twice a week. And then the next thing I'll be thinking about, once I've allocated these exercises into the individual session, is, okay, horizontal pull on this day and this day, is my client going to be recovered? And I might just start off with more reps in reserve in week 1, see how they are, and push on from there. Or there might be some other modifications I need to make. So for example, on my split stance work here, when I know I've got hip dominant movements coming up, I might want to avoid selections like Bulgarian split squats that really put that glute through a lengthened position, because that could be quite damaging to the individual. So maybe we go for something like a front foot elevated split squat, where we get more knee dominant movement, because the squat isn't going to be the primary focus of that day. So it's just little changes like that. But let's work through session 2. So we said our main exercise in red is going to be our vertical push. If I can find that. Okay, and that's going to be our compound movement, and all I'm going to actually do is just copy these guys from up here. Okay, so just copy that, because we'll keep the same set configuration just to keep it simple for now. Okay, so we've got our vertical push in place that you can see there, and now I've got a horizontal pull, a vertical pull, a supine hinge, and a split stance exercise. So the ones I'm really not going to put together are the lower body exercises and the upper body exercises, but apart from that I can probably make a few changes, right? So we're going to look at this and say, okay, well, what's going to be pretty demanding? It's going to be split squat work, or maybe it's chin-ups, right? So actually let's get a vertical pull in there, and then I'm going to pair that with my supine hinge, and supine hinge can work really well here. So when I say supine hinge, glute bridge, hip thrust, stuff like that, because they're a hip hinge that trains the muscle in a short position, but now there's no grip competing, right? If I was doing like an RDL and a pull-up, that could be a big issue. So they'd work well. And then what am I left with? My horizontal pull with my split stance work. Nice higher rep stuff to finish, right? So I'm going to go horizontal pull, split stance work. Now, what could be an issue with a horizontal pull and a split stance? If we're holding dumbbells for a long time, maybe grip becomes an issue. So maybe we added some grip support, or we change the loading position. It could be, barbell on the back. It could be rack position. It could be Zercher position, double kettlebell position. That would remove the issue of grip, right? And then they'd work well. But hopefully you can see from this example, this idea of organizing my microcycle so that I can see where, to allow the most recovery for the main lifts, I then place the main lifts, I place the secondary lifts, the pushing and the pulling, to make sure that I'm training body parts twice a week, I've got good session density. And then if I needed to, I don't know, let's say that it was hip dominant into the next day straight away, then I'm going to make those modifications, more reps in reserve, less sets, shorter muscle lengths. The other thing that we'll notice is that the supine hinge, the split stance work, and the knee flexion, they are only being trained once in the week. And what do we do typically if a muscle's only being trained once in a week? We may want to increase the training stress with some intensification method because they've got such a long recovery period. Now, that might be the case for something like a chest or delts or something like that, but anterior delt, for example, would actually be trained with horizontal pushing, right? But with my supine hinge, I can look at it and say, yeah, even though the glutes are only being trained in this shortened position or with a supine hinge once in a week, the glutes are still being hit multiple times. Same thing for split squats. I wouldn't need to intensify that, but I could potentially add some intensification methods onto the knee flexion, not because it's the hamstring's obviously going to be hit with some hip dominant movement, but it's the only time that short head of the biceps femoris might be hit. So I might add an intensification method onto that. So into that session one, I could come into the knee flexion, and that's where I might add in some intensification, like some a drop set or a rest pause to really drive up that per set stress. But that isn't really the focus of this lecture. The focus of this lecture is you being able to see how we get this thought process of saying, okay, I know how many slots I've got, and I know where I've allocated it in terms of slots to movement patterns. Now I've got to organize my week. And so what am I doing when I'm organizing my week? I'm placing the biggest movements first to allow maximum performance, so enough recovery between those sessions. I'll then place the most biggest and demanding exercises and try and keep them away from each other where possible. If I can't, then I modify reps in reserve, number of sets, and potentially exercise selection. Once I've got those in place, I place my pushing, so trying to keep my too much pushing together on one session, spread that out. Pulling, spread that out to allow me to have those complementary pairs of upper, lower, or pushing, pulling, of hinging and pressing, of squatting and pulling, supine hinging and pressing or pulling. They're all there. Split stance lends itself pretty well. And then we can make the individual choice of the exercises. And the exercise for you or one client might be goblet squat. Another client, it might be, a landmine potato sack squat, which is one of my favorites. But that can be individualized over time, but the set configuration would still make sense. This template would still make sense in terms of a microcycle organization or planning your week. So I really hope that's been helpful. This template will be available to you at the end of this training block, but I hope that helps you see the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve once we've allocated our slots and we have to come and get those jigsaw pieces out on the table.